This is an introduction to web development using HTML5 and JavaScript. I'll be walking you through the process of building a user registration page in HTML5 and then adding interactivity on the client using JavaScript. You can use most any editor to create a web page. For this example, I'll be using Notepad++. That's a free application which you can get off the internet. We'll start by adding a doc type to our document, and a doc type instructs the browser as to which version of HTML we're using. We'll be using HTML5, so this is what your doc type would look like for HTML5. Next, we'll add a begin and end HTML tag. This is required. Within the HTML tag, we'll add a head and a body. The head contains information about the document, and the body contains the actual document. In my head, I'll add a title for our web page, and we'll call this user registration. And now we're ready to start writing the markup for our document. We'll start by adding a header, H1, that's the highest level and the largest. We'll call this user registration page. Has a begin and end tag. Not all end tags are required for HTML elements. For example, with a paragraph, you have to have a begin tag, but you do not need to enter an end tag. Alright, we'll save this document. We'll call it user registration. It's important to save it as a hypertext markup language document. And then next we'll see what it looks like in our browser. So we click Run. From Run, we'll click Launch in Firefox. And then here's our registration page. So it has the title, user registration, and then this is our H1. In a user registration page, there's a couple things you want to capture. One is the user ID. Another, you might want to capture the username, and then of course you have to capture the password. So I think this would look good in a table. And we'll add the table right after our H1. Table needs a begin and end tag. And a table is composed of table rows. And within table rows are table cells. I'm thinking I might want maybe 3 rows, so I'm just going to copy and paste these, and then I can start adding the information they want. I want a user ID. I want to capture the user name. Then I want their password. And then I want them to confirm their password. All right. We want to capture the contents of what the user types in a text box, and that's referred to as an input box. An input box does not have an end. We'll give this a type of text, and then we can copy this and paste it to our other 3 elements. We'll save it, refresh our page. There we have a nice form. User ID, my password, my username, and then my password. Notice a problem here: when I enter my password, it's echoed on the screen. That's not very secure. Really, we just want to display maybe some bullets, some unreadable text. You can do that by changing the value for the type attribute. We can set it to password. Save it, refresh my page, and now when I enter a password, it's not echoed on the screen. Okay, so our form's starting to look like something, but it really doesn't do a lot. So the next thing I think we want to add is a button, submit. So when the button is clicked, eventually all this information would be saved back to the server. So we'll add a button. that has a begin and end, and we want the button to be called submit. Save it, refresh, and now we have our button. But when we click the button, nothing special really happens. So we want to add some JavaScript to the submit button and add some interactivity to our web page. Before we do that, there's two concepts that you need to understand, and that's events and functions. Events are things that happen to HTML elements. Functions, they're a named section of code which is only executed when it's called. So again, events are things that happen to HTML elements. The submit button is an HTML element, and when that submit button is clicked, you can subscribe to the on-click event. So again, event are things that happen to HTML elements. So when the user clicks the submit button, we want to subscribe to the on-click event, and we want to call a function that we're going to write in JavaScript to do some special processing. So let's get started. We'll go to our submit button. We'll say on click. Then we want to call a custom function called validate form. We're having parentheses. I won't talk about why you need parentheses. And then that'll be an advanced tutorial. So we want to write a JavaScript function called validate form. You can place your JavaScript anywhere in your HTML page. For this example, we're going to put it in the head. So we'll start a begin script tag, an end script tag, then we'll write a function called validate form. We'll have a begin and an end, and when the form is called, we want to throw up an alert just for testing to make sure everything's working right. Hello world. And then we'll save this. So when the user clicks our submit button, we listen to the on-click event. That gets fired. We call our custom function called validate form. The validate form gets executed. That then calls a predefined function called alert. That's a built-in JavaScript function, which will then display the alert with the text hello world if everything works right. Refresh our page, click submit button, and there's our alert. All right, but that's good to show you how an alert works, but it really doesn't do anything great for this form. Really what we want to do is when the user clicks the submit button, we want to make sure that they entered a user ID. If they did not enter a user ID, then we want to prevent them from submitting the form to the web server. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to check the contents of the user ID text box and alert the user only if it's blank. So we'll go back to our function, and we're going to create a variable called user ID. And eventually that's going to contain the contents of the text box for the user ID. Before we do that, we need to give our input text box a unique value. So we'll go to ID, and we'll call this user ID. And that uniquely identifies this element. There can only be one element with the ID of user ID. So we're going to use the document object model to get the contents of the user ID. The document object model is an API for accessing contents in the browser. And it starts with document dot, and then we want to get the contents of the text in the input box. So we'll do document dot get element by ID, and then we pass it the ID name, and that's it. So the ID name is user ID, and then we're going to throw up an alert just for testing, user ID dot value. So what should happen is when the user enters their ID, clicks the submit button fires the onClick event. The onClick event calls the validate form function. The validate form function gets the user ID element, and then it extracts the value that was entered in the user ID element and calls the predefined function alert and displays the user's ID. And it worked just great. user ID, SEG, submit. Okay, but that really doesn't do a lot. You know, it verifies that we got the contents of the text box, but now what we need to do is see if it's blank. So we're going to write an if statement. An if statement allows us to check something conditionally and then do something based on that test. So we'll say if blank equals user ID dot value, then we want to do something. We'll have a begin and end. We'll throw up an alert and say user ID is required. We'll save this. So now we have a user ID. So if we click the submit button, we got an alert, and we shouldn't. So what did we do wrong? All right, so I don't think we did anything wrong. I think we simply forgot to refresh the page. So I refresh the page, click submit, nothing happens, which is right. I don't enter a user ID, I click submit, and I get my alert, which is great. Okay, let's do one last check, and that's to confirm that the password the user entered is the same that the user entered a second time, to confirm that they entered the correct password. So we're going to put that in the validate form function, and we're going to create two new variables, var password and var confirm password. So we're going to get the contents of that. All right, so now we have one variable, a variable called password, and we have another variable called confirm password. So then what we want to do is check to make sure that they match, and we're going to do that again with an if statement. So we'll say if password dot value equals confirm password dot value, then everything would be fine. But we don't want to do that. We want to say if they're not equal. Then we'll throw up an alert and say passwords must match. We're missing one last thing, and that is to set an ID for our password and confirm password. Otherwise, we won't be able to access them. All right, we'll save this, refresh our browser, enter a user ID, submit, everything is fine. Test, test, submit. All right, that passed, but let's enter a password that does not match. And then we get our alert, passwords must match. That's it. Thank you very much.